welcome back. The MoCo Millennial has been sort of on vacation. We did a few blog entries. We had the fundraiser event 2 weeks ago, I think. We're now recording on Easter/April Fool's Day. I'm sure it'll be after this day once it's all up, but be aware that nothing we're saying should be an April Fool's joke. I think it's all going to be real.
Hope not.
No fake news.
No fake news.
No fake news today. Although what also isn't fake news is it's 65 degrees today, and tomorrow is supposed to snow. Yeah. So
global warming at its finest.
Absolutely. So I'm here with Evan Glass, and he's yet another candidate for at-large, Montgomery County Council at-large. I announced that I was running today, but that was an April Fool's joke. So
join the field.
Yeah.
You're the 34th. Come on.
I thought there were. I guess not everyone filed, but there were 30-something people that at least had talked about running. So here we go again. Why don't you tell someone about your background, why you're running for this position? I know you ran for D5 years ago. But yes, your background, what got you involved, and why at large? Why now?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here, Helen. And so I am running for the Montgomery County Council at large, and I am currently the executive director of a nonprofit organization called Gandhi Brigade Youth Media. And we operate free after-school programming throughout Montgomery County for high school and middle school students in underserved communities and teach them digital media and civic engagement. And so that's what I do during the daytime. And a little bit more about me. I came here by way of Long Island, New York. My family moved from Brooklyn to Long Island, and my parents divorced when I was young, so it was just my mother and me growing up in our house. And she ended up working 2 jobs to support the family, support me. And it's probably because of that I watched a lot of television and ended up eventually coming down to DC to become a broadcast journalist, and studied at American University and worked at CNN for 12 years. And while I was at CNN covering presidential campaigns, Congress, national affairs, I would come back home to Silver Spring and help build sidewalks and crosswalks, and then worked with my neighbors to get developers to build more green space, and worked with then State Senator Jamie Raskin to create a safer environment by forcing a sleazy motel to clean up its act, because a 55-year-old neighbor of mine told me that she was walking home from the metro and she was propositioned across the street from our apartment. And I contacted then State Senator Jamie Raskin and said, can you help us? And he absolutely did. And so it was realizing how important local civic engagement is that got me to where I am today. And so I founded the South Silver Spring Neighborhood Association. I joined the Board of Conservation Montgomery when I realized that we were lacking green space in our downtown areas. And joined a bunch of other boards and commissions, and am now a candidate for the Montgomery County Council at large.
Yeah, and you noted your CNN background. You have a very good broadcast voice, much better than mine. But you're one of those people I hear you talk, and I could already envision you in that kind of speaking role. And I don't know, maybe by November in a higher role of that. So I do know that you ran for council in District 5. That would be this area, Tacoma Park, Silver Spring. So
all the way up to Burtonsville.
Yes, yeah. Yes. And so I guess you're not part of the wave, the Trump wave or the term limits wave of people, all these new faces running for office. So what specifically made you decide to run for council and then to run for this year's at-large open race?
Sure, that's a good question. So in 2014, you mentioned term limits, and sometimes they happen by law, and sometimes that happens naturally. And so in 2013, 2014, the council member in District 5, which is where I ran, the council member Valerie Irvin announced that she wasn't running for re-election. And she and others encouraged me to run for her seat. And before then, I had never gotten involved in electoral politics. I was involved in civic affairs, I was involved in nonprofits, and it was because for most of my adult life, I was a journalist at CNN, and so I couldn't get involved in Republican issues or Democratic issues. I got involved in issues that a community got involved in: pedestrian safety, crime, other things like that. And it wasn't until I left CNN in 2011 when I was asked by two elected officials to join the board of Equality Maryland. And at that point in time, in 2011, marriage equality was not law of the land here in Maryland, and it had actually failed twice before in the state legislature. And so I was freed from the shackles of objective journalism, and I could say I'm a gay man who supports marriage equality, and I threw myself into that political fight. And so on election night in 2012, when Maryland became the first state to pass marriage equality on referendum, had I still been at CNN, I would have been at Mitt Romney's headquarters in Boston. That was what my assignment, right? I know. But instead, I was with my husband at the Marriage Equality Victory Party in Baltimore, which was a way better party. But it unleashed real politics for me, and it was personal. And from that point on, people asked me to do more things and join more boards, and then running for office myself. And so when I was asked to run for office in 2014, I had never knocked on a door, never made a phone call. No, you have more experience now than I did in electoral politics. But because I'd been president at that time of two civic associations and had served on various nonprofit board of directors and had been in the community working for my neighbors for more than a decade, I ended up losing that race by 1%. And took time off, took the last 3 years off working for the organization where I'm now executive director, Gandhi Brigade. My husband and I had dinners all the time together. I walked my dogs multiple times a day or a week. And it was last year that people encouraged me to run for county council because of the term limits. And when I announced that I was going to, Councilmember Tom Hucker, who I lost to by 1%, endorsed my campaign along with a number of other elected officials, and here we are today.
Yeah, I know people, I've said this in other interviews, but people have varying opinions on the term limits vote, and it did pass. 70% of the vote did get it, and everyone had their reasons. The Robin Ficker Brigade wants to say that it's because we want more Republicans, but what may end up happening is we get a very much more progressive council and executive. So I don't know. I'm no fortune teller. I have no idea how it's going to go, but it makes things interesting, in the least, however people look at it.
Well, so, term limits did pass by, I believe, 70%, overwhelmingly. I had a divided household. I did not support term limits because I believe that term limits are ultimately the election, and people make that decision known by voting. My husband, on the other hand, actually voted for term limits. He thinks that we're ready for a change, and in 12 years, which is what the term is, if you can't make the change that you sought or that you stated when you first ran, well, then time's up. And I actually don't disagree with that. 12 years is a good long time in municipal government.
No, I won't go down this rabbit hole too much because there's a lot of things we want to talk about, but at the time of the vote, I was neutral. I had zero opinion on it. I've heard a lot of compelling arguments in favor of it, but was skeptical. Now, if you were to ask me now, I wouldn't have voted for it because I would say that things like public financing, maybe open primaries, I'm not sure how I feel about that, and ranked choice voting could potentially be a better solution than having an arbitrary legal term limit. That's kind of where I stand.
Yeah.
But
I think those are all wonderful suggestions, and I realized back in 2014 how important some of these issues were, which is why I am actually the only candidate running for council who testified in support of public financing, because I realized in my first run how important it was, because it's the best way to create good government.
Exactly.
And so I supported it then, and I'm actually the only candidate now who's testified in Annapolis in support of public financing for our state delegates and state senators, because I think that it will also level the playing field and open and create new opportunities for others.
Yeah, and so that segues perfectly into what I wanted to talk to you about, because you say that one of your priorities is to focus on good governance. And when I hear good governance, I think, oh, well, maybe budget mismanagement, maybe general corruption issues. Like, that's what I associate with the term. But you had some other specifics in mind. So, first of all, what aspects are you considering with governance as your priority, and where do you see the major issues in Montgomery County to be addressed?
Sure. So, I was a journalist at CNN for 12 years, and I covered Congress and national political affairs. And legislative bodies like Congress really do two things. They approve a budget, and then they also provide oversight. And those are the hearings that we see. And if things aren't running right or need to be done better, you create laws to improve those systems. Here in Montgomery County, the council, the legislative body, approves the budget, should provide oversight, and then also deals with land use issues. So it's a separate, a third leg of that stool. But in terms of oversight, we need to be doing a better job of managing our large $5.5 billion bureaucracy. It is a big challenge, and I say this because there's a lot of things I want to do, and we need to get our basics down first in order to do better things. And so some of those things that we need to do better that I want to look at is making sure that some of our mom and pop businesses are able to do their jobs. And if you want to open up a restaurant, or you have a small store and you want to maybe open up a second bathroom or improve some infrastructure, the Department of Permitting Services is a vast bureaucracy that you will have an inspector come and say you need to fix 1, 2, and 3 items. And then that small business will fix it, but then another inspector will come and say, forget 1, 2, and 3. You need 4, 5, and 6. And if you're that mom and pop store, what are you supposed to do in the meantime?
It's inconsistent.
It's inconsistent, right? Because they're not coordinating, because those channels just aren't there. And in the county where we want to support our small businesses, where 96% of the businesses are small, they're not all Marriott or Discovery or United Therapeutics or Amazon. We'll see. But they're small businesses, and we want to support them. And I think this is just a really simple way to do that, but we need someone to look at the regulations and make sure that as long as health and there's no risk of injury, that we can streamline some of that. So that we can let our mom and pops, because the problem is we all see all these chain restaurants popping up all throughout Montgomery County. And that's because they have the legal team, they have the money to weather these storms. And if we really want to support some of our small businesses, we need to do some common sense things like this. Another area where I think we really need some oversight is, quite frankly, with the construction of the Purple Line. Because here in Montgomery County, we haven't had a good track record of being able to manage public projects very well. We had the Silver Spring Transit Center, which was a problem for a number of years. And in a project that was supposed to take only a year or two and cost $30 million, it took 2-3 times as long and cost almost 3 times as much.
Yeah, apparently I went to a Purple Line seminar, and it was a thing. The Purple Line as a concept is older than I am.
It is.
I heard.
Well, and that's going to cost more than $2 billion. And so we need to make sure that someone's minding the train, literally and figuratively. And what I pledge to do is, as someone who's been president of 2 civic associations and has held government operations accountable as a journalist, I want to make sure that the public-private partnership is doing what they're supposed to do. And I will call them all up before the dais in Rockville for regular updates to make sure they're doing their job right. And as it's being built, the Purple Line, throughout the county, I'll give everybody my phone number. And if they're starting construction earlier than they're supposed to, or they're chopping down trees or bulldozing some sidewalks or streets when they don't have the permitting for it, I'm going to stop them in their tracks. And so that is the type of oversight that we need. Literal tracks, right. And so we need somebody to do that, and I pledge to be that person.
Okay, that's certainly a lot of information to work with, and you articulated it very well. But I do want to get back to the small businesses point. Mm-hmm. Now, this is an area where I'm kind of torn, because we talk about streamlining, certainly the oversight in general, and certainly the regulations, and too many people are saying either deregulate or regulate more, not which regulations are appropriate and which are not. So this is where I'm torn. On one hand, you want to streamline the bureaucracy, right? Like you don't want to have so much money going over to unnecessary kind of management looking over positions. But then on the other hand, it seems like having different standards, different regulations apply in some cases and don't apply in others. I know I'm speaking in a lot of abstract terms, but you say the you need 1, 2, and 3, or you need 4, 5, and 6. If things were painted with too broad strokes, you might say, well, every business needs 1 through 6, or every small businesses need the first 3, large businesses need the 4, 5, and 6. And so the issue being, I seem to think as a non-expert that it's like a case-by-case scenario. This regulation is appropriate here, this regulation is appropriate there, but then it seems like it would be more bureaucratic to have someone analyze each and every single regulatory case.
Sure.
So that's where I'm torn.
So I should clarify, the cases that small businesses, restaurateurs, and others tell me about is that if they want an addition and they have created an addition, some wood structure, and it might be 10 feet by 10 feet, and the first inspector tells them that's okay, but the second one says no, it needs to be 9.5 feet or 11 feet by 10 feet. Though that's the issue. Mm-hmm. It's nothing that's necessarily on paper where discrepancies might arise. It is either misinterpreting some of the regulations or not applying them universally, quite frankly. But there are other examples of things on the books that we need to look at. So back in 2012, 2013, the county executive, Ike Leggett, appointed me to serve on the Nighttime Economy Task Force. He recognized that Montgomery County was not attracting enough young people, millennials, and wanted to bring a group of people together to figure out how we can change some laws to encourage you to come here. And come you did. But one of the things that we learned in this 6 or 7 month process was that restaurants that had open windows or garage doors that they lifted open for outdoor seating were actually breaking the law. That there was a law on the books that said you couldn't have open windows like that and huge doors flung open because they didn't want food to rot or to have flies. Mm-hmm. That's because the law was written in the 20s and 30s and it hadn't been updated. And so one of the things I want to do is spend some time and see what laws are on the books, because I know that all of these laws were very well intentioned. They were to save life and protect the common good and protect employees. Absolutely. These are rooted in well-intentioned places. But decade after decade, where technology has improved so much, we should modernize. Just like some of the taxi laws, are not applied to Uber or Lyft, and I'm not saying they should, but we recognize that they're similar forms of transportation, but just modernized. And that's what I'm talking about. Taking a look at some of these things that new businesses today might or might not need to cater to millennials, and just so that they can perform better, because otherwise they will lose out to the chain stores. And we have to be very aware of that many of us do not like the proliferation of some of these chain restaurants, but we have to recognize sometimes how hard it is for the smaller businesses.
Yeah, and I have taken note of that. I keep hearing stories of such and such business, especially restaurants closing, and this chain is going to move in there. And a lot of the like, not gonna say they're all right wingers, but a lot of people say, oh, it's because of the minimum wage thing, or it's because of the alcohol monopoly, or it's because of this or that or this or that currently hot button council issue. But I have a feeling when you dig deeper, it comes down to these issues as well. It could be a combination of all different kinds of things.
Sure.
That's certainly a good point.
I haven't even mentioned those items because I believe, in the minimum wage and the law that we passed. But there are a lot of other things that we can do to help these businesses. And in our hearts, we always talk about wanting to support our small mom and pop. Mm-hmm. But then when we think about it, what are we doing to help them? And so these are concrete steps that we can take to help them, where we're not tearing ourselves apart, because it's not minimum wage versus not approving it, increasing it, minimizing it. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about just how to help run their physical businesses better.
Yeah, exactly. Now, to finalize this segment, I want to ask, you seem to approach these governance issues very comprehensively, and you seem to have a really good problem-solving mentality. And what, from your background, has given you this level of thoroughness and expertise in these kind of situations, or what has taught you to approach this kind of thought process?
Well, I appreciate that. So I think it's my training as a journalist to listen to people, to actively listen. And so every time I'm engaged in a conversation, I'm hearing everything that person is saying, and my personality is one to make things happen. So I will have conversations, I'll synthesize what everybody's saying, figure out what the problems are, and without compromising my morals, as we were just talking about, figure out creative solutions to move things forward. And I think that's what this conversation is all about, wanting to help small businesses, not wanting to compromise our values on the minimum wage or health care, but figuring out how else we can help them. And that's the approach that I take. Plus, I've been active in Montgomery County civic life and nonprofit life for about 15 years, and I understand how our $5.5 billion budget operates, how it works, how it doesn't work, and those are the skills that I would bring to Rockville.
Yeah, and we certainly need those kind of skills. And when I choose the 4 at-large candidates, and I'm still undecided, so I have people on that are running for at-large. It's all fair game. You're trying to impress me as well. I'm undecided, and one of the things that I'm taking in consideration, and this is why I wish we had some kind of ranked choice system. We really need that this time around. But I like diversity of expertise on the team, and that, I think, is something that's overlooked. Everyone talks of diversity, racial, gender, sexual orientation, or even background, what sector they worked in or something. But I think it's important to have someone that knows a lot about budgets, to have someone that knows a lot about, say, housing and development or environmental issues. Like, you could vote for 4 people that agree with you on the most issues, but if they all are just really honing in on one issue, and you have a hole in some other area, that leaves things kind of lacking. So that's one of the things I'm taking into consideration. But the ability to listen and to not just latch on to that one argument that speaks to your particular opinion or validates what the background you're coming from, that seems really important. Like, to synthesize what you hear and objectively analyze what is actually the priority of the voters, and that's a really good skill, it seems like to have.
And what I'll say is, if you watch the second segment of this interview, I'll share a story how I was able to synthesize and share my opinions with my community to get them to do the right thing.
All right. Well, on that note, we're going to take a short break, and we're going to come back and we'll hear from that story, and we'll talk about how people 30 and under can afford to find housing in Montgomery County, preferably independently. All right. So we'll be back
Stay tuned.
in a short break.